In 1991, an empire that controlled 1/6 of the Earth's surface simply ceased to exist. Not after a devastating war, not after a foreign invasion, but because of something far more silent and unsettling. Something that had been growing from within, invisible for decades, until one day, without warning, it began to collapse before the eyes of the world. And what's most intriguing is that when it finally ended, not even its own leaders fully understood how it had happened, because the Soviet Union did not fall in a single moment. It collapsed slowly, built on human decisions, accumulated mistakes, and a truth no one dared to face. For much of the 20th century, the Soviet Union was more than just a country. It was an idea turned into a superpower, a system that promised equality, control, and order, governed by a single party that didn't just lead, but defined what was true, what was allowed, and what should be feared. And after World War II, it emerged as one of the two greatest forces on Earth, directly rivaling the United States in a global struggle that would become known as the Cold War, a war without direct confrontation, but filled with tension, espionage, proxy conflicts, and a constant race for military, technological, and ideological dominance. And from the outside, the Soviet Union appeared solid, powerful, almost unshakable. But inside, signs of decay were already beginning to appear, signs that few could see or were willing to admit. The Soviet economy was rigidly controlled by the state, based on central planning, where decisions about production, distribution, and pricing were made by bureaucrats far removed from reality. And for a time, it seemed to work, especially during periods of rapid industrialization. But over the years, the flaws of this model became impossible to ignore. Innovation slowed, productivity declined, basic goods became scarce, long lines became part of daily life, and while the West advanced with technology, consumption, and economic growth, the Soviet Union remained trapped in a system that could no longer keep pace with the modern world. But the problem wasn't just economic, it was psychological. Because within the Soviet system, admitting failure was not an option. Mistakes were hidden, numbers were manipulated, reports were altered to satisfy superiors, creating an illusion of stability that masked an increasingly fragile reality. And this growing disconnect between what was said and what was actually happening began to erode the system from within, like a structure that appears strong on the outside but is fundamentally compromised inside. Meanwhile, external pressure continued to rise. The arms race with the United States consumed enormous resources. A significant portion of the GDP was directed toward the military sector, and the constant need to compete technologically placed even more strain on an already weakened economy. And then came Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union decided to intervene militarily to support an allied government, believing it would be a quick and controlled operation. But what they encountered was a long, exhausting, costly, and deeply unpopular war, a conflict that drained resources, demoralized troops, and further exposed the limitations of the Soviet system. And at the same time, inside the country, the population began to feel the weight of it all. Shortages, censorship, lack of prospects, and slowly, something began to change. Not explosively, but quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. People began to doubt. For decades, the state had maintained absolute control over information. Newspapers, radio, television, everything was filtered and shaped to sustain the official narrative. But in the 1980s, that barrier began to weaken. External influences, technological advances, and even the system's own exhaustion made it harder to hide reality. And it was in this environment that a key figure emerged, Mikhail Gorbachev, a leader who came to power in 1985 with a different vision. He did not want to destroy the Soviet system, he wanted to save it. But to do so, he believed deep reforms were necessary. And so two policies were introduced that would change the course of history. Perestroika, an attempt to restructure the economy by introducing elements of a market system, and glasnost, a policy of openness that allowed greater transparency, more freedom of expression, and wider access to information. And on paper, these reforms seemed like the solution, but in practice, they triggered something that could no longer be controlled. Because by allowing people to speak, by allowing information to circulate, Gorbachev did not just open the system, he exposed all its flaws, all its corruption, all its inefficiency, all its repression accumulated over decades. And suddenly, what had once been whispered was being spoken openly. What had once been ignored was being questioned, and what emerged was something the Soviet system had never truly faced before: the loss of control over its own narrative. And with that came nationalist movements. Republics within the Soviet Union began to question their place in the Union. Protests erupted, demands for independence grew stronger, and what had once been a rigid union began to fracture, not because of external attack, but because of internal will, a growing desire for autonomy. Meanwhile, the economy continued to deteriorate. The reforms failed to deliver quick results, instability increased, and the central government seemed increasingly incapable of responding. And then, in 1989, something symbolic happened. The Berlin Wall, one of the most powerful symbols of global division, fell, not by military action, but by popular pressure. And that event did not just mark the end of an era, it sent a clear message: the system was losing control. And from that point forward, collapse was no longer a possibility, it was a matter of time. In 1991, the situation reached its breaking point. Conservative leaders within the government attempted a coup to remove Gorbachev and restore strict control. But the coup failed, and that failure did not strengthen the system, it shattered it, because it revealed to the world and to its own people that the central power no longer held real authority. And after that moment, Soviet republics began declaring independence one after another. And in December 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. Without a final war, without an invasion, it simply collapsed. And the world watched in disbelief, because one of the greatest empires in history had just disappeared. But the real question is not how the Soviet Union fell, it is why it took so long. Because the warning signs were there, the flaws were visible, the problems were known, yet the system endured, sustained by control, fear, and the inability to recognize its own fragility. And perhaps that is the true secret behind the Soviet collapse. It was not just the economy, not just external pressure, not just Gorbachev or his reforms. It was the sum of all these factors, amplified by a system that could not correct itself, that could not admit mistakes, that could not adapt. And when it finally tried to change, it was already too late. Because empires rarely fall all at once, they erode slowly, accumulating invisible cracks until one day they can no longer support their own weight. And when they collapse, it seems sudden, inevitable, but in reality, it was a long process, silent, unfolding over decades. And the story of the Soviet Union reminds us of something fundamental. The greatest danger doesn't always come from external threats, but from the inability to see internal weaknesses. Because in the end, the greatest enemy of that empire did not come from outside, it came from within. And as the world continues to build systems, alliances, and structures of power, the question remains: how many empires today appear strong on the outside, but have already begun to collapse from within? If you want to explore more hidden stories that shaped the world as we know it, make sure to subscribe, because sometimes the most important events in history are the ones that were set in motion long before we ever noticed.